Stanford University.
Good evening. That's a little better. Welcome to the Roger W. Hines Lecture for the 2010-2011 academic year on behalf of the Stanford Office for Religious Life. I'm Scotty McLennan, Dean for Religious Life. In the mid-1990s, the James Irvine Foundation established the Hines Lecture on religion and community. And this lecture series brings the Stanford campus leading thinkers who examine the intersection of systems of belief and practice with human groups and societies. Recent Hines lectures have included the Dalai Lama, Karen Armstrong, Bart Ehrman, Amy Jill Levine, Eboo Patel, and Jim Wallace. There's much to honor in Roger Hines and his legacy. A professor of psychology, then dean, then vice president at the University of Michigan, he came to the University of California at Berkeley, where he served as chancellor from 1965 to 1971. Hines led the American Council on Education and then the Hewlett Foundation until his retirement in 1992. For many years, he lent his energy and wisdom to Stanford, having become a regular participant at our Memorial Church here on campus and a consultant to university leaders. We're delighted to honor him again this year with tonight's lecture. And I'm grateful to Religious Studies Professor Emeritus Robert Gregg, formerly the Dean for Religious Life, who worked closely with the Irvine Foundation to establish this lecture series. And I want to recognize Na-Sun Cho, the Rathbun Program Manager and Director of Outreach for the Office for Religious Life, who's been the central organizer of tonight's event. Bob Gregg will now introduce this year's Roger W. Hines Lecture.
Good evening. I'd like to precede my introduction of our guest by registering thanks particularly to Joanne Sanders and Greg Schaefer, whose effort to lure the bishop back to her alma mater for tonight's lecture and tomorrow's sermon were steady and successful. We are grateful. I shall not review, even in outline, Bishop Katharine Jefferts Schori's life and works, but you should know that her studies of biology at Stanford and at Oregon State involved worm-like creatures in the ocean's mud, squid and octopuses, that she is a hereditary flyer of airplanes, that she once taught religious studies and attended theological school in Berkeley, that she married a mathematician and with him produced a daughter, also a pilot. Once ordained, she loved her work in parishes, and then as Bishop of Nevada, at which point her intelligent and visionary leadership was so noticed that she became the Episcopal Church's presiding bishop, the first but not the last woman to lead one of the Anglican Communion's 38 provinces. Her election must still be a daily source of pride to her, as it is to many of us, but I know from my attention to the media that she presses on every day to current challenges and hopes in religion and society, the title of the Hines Lecture, which now must be called Religions and Societies. My friend Roger Hines would have loved to meet and hear Bishop Jefferts Schori. Connecting chapter headings in her new book, The Heartbeat of God, which you will have a chance to purchase and have signed tonight, her chapter headings reveal a great deal about what centrally occupies her. Connecting with the margins. Connecting faith with public life. connecting with creation, connecting with the heart of God, and healing broken connections. Her concluding section in the last chapter is, I think, also a part of her job description. Its title is Finding God in Dissent. Tonight's lecture, after which we'll be able to have a dialogue with our speaker, is entitled Beauty and Power, Truth and Good, a 21st Century Quest for the Real. Please join me in welcoming Bishop Katharine Jefferts Schori.
Thank you. It really is a delight to be here. I'm going to start with a religious question. Why are we here? I don't think we're here looking for exactly what some of my classmates sought 40 years ago. Once in a while, when the lecture was less than engaging in this place, a couple of dogs would be let in and cause a row on stage. It was a way of avoiding the challenge of paying attention to the subject at hand. Nor are we here to wait for the rapture. We're not here to be entertained or to sit around and wait for the train. Why are we here as human beings? What's our purpose in life? If not a passive approach to life, what? And in more immediate terms, what role does the Leland Stanford University play in human purpose? I want to invite us to think about those eternal human questions, and the title of this lecture is full of invitations to big picture thinking. The real. It almost ought to be in German, der Realen. Quest, beauty, truth, and good. And finally, power. What do those big subjects have to do with the meaning of existence and how we choose to live our lives? Those are the kinds of questions that human beings have wrestled with since before they first started painting images on the walls of caves like Lascaux, or pecking patterns on rocks in the Aboriginal art of Australia or North America. Seeking answers to those questions is grounded in quest, like the ancient practice of walkabout. And whether the quest is consciously understood as spiritual quest or not, it almost always is. The quest frequently takes the form of storytelling about some transit or transition or transformation. Religion is what happens when a group of people claim similar understandings and tell the same stories about the answers to those big questions. The ability to be self-aware and to spend some time in reflection, as we're doing here tonight, is an intrinsic part of that questing and storytelling behavior. It requires a certain amount of leisure or a conscious choice to devote a portion of one's life to seeking answers to questions like these. Now, physiologists and evolutionary biologists will tell you that the sleep pattern of human beings who live with a natural diurnal rhythm are different from those who live with major inputs of artificial light, alarm clocks, and imposed schedules. In the middle of winter in latitudes with significant seasonal variation, human beings sleep more hours through the night. But their sleep is of a significantly different kind than it is in summer. winter sleep includes intervals of semi-wakefulness and reflection, which is perhaps where prayer was born. The psalmist knew something of this when he wrote, "My heart teaches me night after night." Human beings in search of meaning have followed many paths: art, storytelling, spiritual quest through physical journey or herbally facilitated exploration, the walkabout of Australian Aborigines, the Native American vision quest or sun dance, the tales of the Odyssey or Le Morte d'Arthur, Icelandic sagas themselves born of long winter nights, or the use of peyote in the Native American church. Even the LSD-fueled journeying of Timothy Leary had some roots in spiritual quest. For millennia, human beings have chosen or have been exposed to a variety of methods in the quest for meaning and the real. Once the wanderlust is acknowledged, that itch to go looking for answers, a desire to name the ineffable goal emerges. The goal is related to the utopian dreams and images of what life is meant to be, the direction human beings are bound, or maybe where the good ones go when they die. That search for meaning, for what is more than what I see and experience most of the time, that desire for an answer to why, is what keeps at least some human beings on that figurative road. In some very real sense, the purpose of institutions like this one is to equip travelers for life. Earlier societies equipped their young by means of rituals, often involving seclusion in a community of peers, where they learned the stories of the world and their local community from a cadre of wise elders. That's still the path of initiation into adulthood in many so-called primitive societies, where the rituals may include tattoos, bodily piercings, or other alterations, like knocking out or realigning teeth, shaving, plucking, or decorating one's hair, or dyeing it, the use of stimulants and intoxicants, fasting or consuming particular foods, games of strength and wit, and the hope for eventual emergence into a mature role. There is, of course, no resemblance here. The human question about a mature role is an abiding one. What does it mean to live a good life? Where are we going as fellow travelers in this world? The centuries-old pattern of education in the West, and I don't just mean the Western United States, grew out of a desire to equip the young for life as travelers. The goal was integration in society through proper relationship with self, others, and the real. The quest for the real is how I want to frame an examination of that basic human question about purpose and destination. Quest comes from the Latin quaerere, to seek or gain or ask. It's a journey in search of something. And the real is shorthand for what is of utmost value. It comes from the Latin res, or thing. And I'm going to use it to mean what's actually most valuable and lasting, the result of the journey, in the same way that the Velveteen Rabbit uses it. Once you are real, you can't become unreal again. It lasts for always. Real isn't how you were made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real. Does it hurt? Asked the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. When you are real, you don't mind being hurt. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up, he asked, or bit by bit? It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily or have sharp edges or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. The real is detectable, but it's not reducible to simple sense data. It has something to do with what makes life worth living and what invites human beings into becoming more than they think is possible. It partakes of the transcendent and mysterious and numinous. It has something to do with the eternal, and it extends beyond the individual. The real has to do with recognizing that you are part of something beyond yourself and the extent of your sensory inputs, and also that your own actions participate in and influence that greater reality. It has something to do with what John Donne said about living and dying. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And later, any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. The real is the quality or activity that unites all of what is, what theistic religions call God. Going in search of the real is about discovering how you are related to all the rest. Much of the philosophizing in the West since at least the late 1960s has led toward a kind of relativistic nihilism that says there is no such thing as the real, because we simply cannot know what is real or true. In that system, therefore, I can't possibly claim that my truth is truer than yours or someone else's. Stephen Colbert's invocation of truthiness, where truth no longer has any objective reality and is reduced to whatever I want to invent to support my gut feeling, that's a response to the more anarchic characteristics of postmodern thought. Yet that postmodern relativizing tendency has given us at least the possibility of greater humility when it comes to imposing our version of the truth on others. That kind of humility and willingness to rethink postulates is part of what Phyllis Tickle is fond of invoking as the hemi-millennial garage sale. Her point is that every 500 years or so, the Christian community hauls a lot of stuff out of its house, gets rid of some of it, and begins to use the bits it hangs on to in new ways and in new relationships. Dawning awareness of that relativizing tendency has also led a lot of people of faith either to hunker down and hang on tighter to their edge of truth, what we tend to call fundamentalism, or to throw in the towel and say, well, if what I thought was true now isn't, why should I bother? The fear and anger engendered by that kind of relativism can evoke both stubborn closed-mindedness and despair. But the human questing doesn't stop for long, particularly if we look beyond the emptier cul-de-sacs of postmodern relativism. Spiritual hunger is rampant in our culture, in the West, and indeed across the globe. Even if the old answer no longer satisfies, most of us are bound to keep on looking or reacting. Human beings have an inherent sense, maybe born of those long winter nights, that there must be a reason for existence that moves beyond the animal passions for food, drink, and reproducing oneself. Not that those are bad things. Marcus Borg said in my presence once that he thought that heaven looked a good deal like good food, good wine, and good sex. That's a playful riposte to the nihilism of utter relativism, and it's not simple hedonism. Other creative responses to the critical dead ends of postmodernism have generally been accompanied by a return to the other virtues on which Western philosophical systems have been based for millennia. If truth can't be fully defined, or if truth alone cannot lead you to the real, turn to beauty, thence to love, and to an ethic of compassion and justice, moral goodness. In the process, a richer and deeper understanding of truth, one that moves beyond legalism or logical positivism, is also emerging. The beautiful, good, and true still underlie the human quest for meaning. Around 400 of the Common Era, Augustine of Hippo spoke memorably of this shift from law to love as, love God and do as you please. The real can be sought on a road where the guideposts are the ones anciently known as truth, beauty, and goodness. We may have a more playful response to those virtues than the ancient philosophers did, but the virtues endure. Even if the true is no longer sufficiently understood as independent, rationally provable postulates, it still has something to do with what motivates us to keep growing, learning, and journeying. In its relationship to beauty and goodness, the true also partakes of altruism. Now, that may be postmodern playfulness, given that altruism's root means the other, but the word ploy reminds us that truth cannot be solely inwardly directed. It must participate in the other man's death, in connection to the main, in connection to the neighbor. For many years, evolutionary biologists couldn't understand altruistic behavior until they began to think beyond the level of individual reproductive success. What is beautiful? For eons, definitions of beauty have had something to do with geometric relationships, meaning, or timeliness. Today, beauty is often related to the semi-chaotic nature of creation, to the playful variation on a theme found in the branching patterns of trees or capillaries or rivers, or the diversity of human faces. Beauty has something to do with both order and playfulness, or the discoveries in a journey toward meaning. I sat on an airplane recently in front of a mother with a very active and vocal toddler. Her mother couldn't keep her in her seat for more than a few minutes. The flight attendant arrived with beverages and snacks and asked this little girl what she wanted. Juice. What kind? Apple. Well, first you need to have your seatbelt fastened. Can you do that? Can you show me? Click. Beautiful. Order, playfulness, journey, discovery. The good is most intrinsically related to moral goodness, to an ethic that promotes right relationships, decisions and actions that ultimately lead to loving interpersonal relationships and justice at the level of the community and society. The good leads to more creative possibility, greater freedom, and more abundant life. What does the road look like in the quest for these, which we call education? The ancient concept of paideia is about passing on a set of values to the next generation. As the old proverb puts it, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Pedagogy is focused on imparting moral values and cultural norms. Until fairly recently, two significantly different forms of tutelage were envisaged: the liberal arts and the servile arts. The terms have not so much to do with our current political parties or with feudal realities, but with the basic understanding and purpose of education. The liberal arts are designed to produce free citizens who can think. And those arts are studied and cultivated for their own sake, for the sole purpose of the kind of human being who results and the quality of life that person may live. The servile arts may have at one time been the province of servants, but they are basically technical or utilitarian functions, studied and cultivated for the use to which they can be put, like engineering, horseshoeing, surgery, agriculture. The educational focus of most institutions like this one has become a mix of the two. But there's a difference between learning for the kind of life one will live and learning to earn a living. Not unlike, perhaps, the contrast between eating to live and living to eat. The liberal arts included the values to which the title of this lecture refers: the good, true, and beautiful, classically taught through the study of writing, reasoning, and speaking, mathematics and astronomy, music, drama, dance, history. Those arts help to shape a good life and underlie much of the social construct in the West. They have parallels in other major philosophical systems. Those guideposts on the journey, good, truth, beauty, lead the seeker toward what makes life meaningful. In spite of recent paradigmatic shifts in philosophical and cultural values, I want to argue that those still form the core of what it means to live a good life. What has changed is how we explicate those values, what their content includes. Some remarkable research about values has been going on around the world in the last 30 years about the basic cultural values of different nations and how they change. Ronald Inglehart started this work in the late 1970s, and it continues now in more than 90 societies through something called the World Values Survey. The research has shown two dimensions of value-related cultural variation and change. One axis beginning with traditional values associated with agricultural subsistence societies who pay a lot of attention to religious observance, nationalism, and submission to authority, and generally have patriarchal attitudes toward marriage and family life. Those values are about belonging to a stable, traditional society, almost always religiously framed. The data show that as a society moves out of basic subsistence agricultural economy into an industrialized one, those societies' shared values become less traditional and move toward what they term secular rational values, and they're largely the opposite of traditional values. Another set of opposed values parallel the shift from industrialized economies to knowledge-based economic systems, as social concerns move from survival to self-expression or self-agency. For people concerned about basic survival, values are focused on security, defense against the outsider, what we'd call xenophobia, and a general sense of resignation rather than hope about life and one's place in it. As survival becomes less of a concern, cultural values shift toward finding the kind of good life that we've been talking about. The theorists call this a move towards self-expressive values that prioritize care for the environment, openness to those who represent difference, whether of gender, sexual orientation, or nationality, and a desire for greater economic and political self-determination. That shift is also reflected in changing family relationships and child-rearing values, as well as greater inherent trust in interpersonal relationships, a push for democratic institutions, and what the public would generally call happiness. It's directly related to the kind of freedom that is implied in a liberal education. Plotting the cultural values of individual nations on these two value set axes produces clusters of nations grouped by geographic location and national political histories. Societies with high survival and traditional values are clustered in parts of Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. Nations like Bangladesh, Zimbabwe, Jordan, and Morocco. High traditional and self-expressive values are more often found in Latin America. The Northern European and Scandinavian countries and Japan cluster around high secular, rational, and self-expression values, and the Eastern European countries cluster around high survival and secular rational values. The poorest developing nations focus on survival, and traditional religiously based values are the usual expression of that. The wealthier, knowledge-based economies of Japan and Northern Europe lie in the opposite quadrant. This nation, the United States, has high self-expressive values, but still holds significantly traditional values, particularly about religiously mediated issues like abortion, nationalism, and deference to authority. At the same time, the collective cultural values of different societies are shifting fairly rapidly, at timescales on the order of a generation. It appears that the current values conflicts are likely to moderate significantly within a generation if, and this is a big if, current realities don't lead to diminished confidence about economic security. That's not to say that another values clash won't take their place, but the ongoing movement is toward greater inclusiveness, tolerance for difference, and freedom as economic stability increases. The Islamic Spring we're witnessing is a remarkable example of the kind of shift that these studies predict. The young in countries with highly authoritarian regimes who have grown up in reasonably predictable economies with decent educations want a different kind of governance. They begin to crave greater freedom when basic needs are reliably supplied. The various parts of that values map will all look for goodness, truth, and beauty, but they'll be defined in vastly different ways. One of the interesting conclusions in the current iteration of the values study has to do with the role of religion. one aspect of the values shift away from tradition towards secularization leads to a reduced attachment to religion, at least to a traditional religious understanding. The shift from survival towards self-expression, however, may lead to an increased interest in religious questions and practices, but not in the traditional sense. We're seeing this in our own society, and a characteristic comment defines it. I'm spiritual, not religious. Traditional religious participation is declining across this society, and yet the big questions of meaning and existence seem to be of increasing interest, though they are framed differently. This has been called an expression of emancipative values. It's connected to the kind of liberal education we've been talking about and to the values research that shows an increasing desire for freedom as economic security increases. The role of religion in the world's great religious traditions has always been, at its core, about human liberation. Each of those world traditions has had excursions into more reified and law-based understandings of the core truths of the tradition, which at the extreme become fundamentalisms. Yet each would say that getting the basic relationship right between the human being and the divine implies that all the other relationships will follow. Augustine's words are as true today as they were 1,600 years ago. Love God and do as you please. The basic relationship is the good, as we hinted at in the move out of postmodernist fatalism into aesthetics and then compassion. Moral goodness can be a product of love, a particular kind of love. But when love is demanded through mere obedience or adherence to law, it often shrinks in on itself and eventually produces bitterness or hate. Love is creative when it's freely given. That seems to be the parallel conclusion of the values survey, that societies based in survival don't have great expectations for individual or societal goodness. They don't have a great deal of hope for happiness or a better life. When life holds adequate security, either through external sufficiency or through internal attitudinal choice, love has a chance to lead us toward the good and beautiful and true. Whole societies, through increasing external economic security, are discovering that road. I want to spend the remainder of our time thinking about the particulars of the real end of the journey, which is not an end, but a journeying, for the work and the walk are never finished. And I want to attend to the remaining word in the title, power. I'm going to frame it in somewhat more overtly religious language. The Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, share a common framework of understanding the real. We don't share all the details, but we do have a shared base for starting the conversation. We can journey together for a very long way down that road. All talk about a restored world of peace and justice, where human beings live in right relationship with God and with each other. The more familiar images or phrases for that vision are the reign of God, the peaceable kingdom, shalom, salam. A number of them include a garden, both a reflection of the Garden of Eden, from which human beings were expelled in the second creation story in Genesis, and the paradisa, or walled garden, from which we get the word paradise. The garden is about abundant food, good wine, and sacred relationships. All of those are highly particular visions of enough to eat and drink, and not mere adequacy, but the abundance for a feast. Human beings in this vision are living out their full lives, unafflicted by disease or sickness or war. That takes justice, where scarcity is unknown because resources are shared, and each lives rightly with others. All of this dream or vision is related to living in right relationship with the real, with God, or as some might put it, with the cosmos, with all that is. Some of the bolder versions of this dream, like the Song of Songs, or the poetry of some of the mystics in each tradition, move into a vision of holy and intimate union that is either the best of human sexual experience or human union with the divine, or both. Borg's comment about heaven, good food, good wine, good sex, is actually a traditional part of that vision. The Abrahamic traditions offer this vision as the goal of human existence. Even though various fundamentalizing tendencies in each tradition have pushed it out of this life into an afterlife, or insisted that the dream is only open to a privileged few who fulfill the fine points of religious law. At the core of each, however, is a move from legalism toward compassion. Paradoxically, sometimes each has used the law as a kind of spiritual cell in the monastic sense, a cell within which a deeper truth can emerge. But the movement from law to compassion pervades the core, and compassion becomes the new understanding of moral good. Perception of beauty shifts as well toward the innate beauty of creation. It's related to what Irenaeus in the 2nd century said about human liveliness. The glory of God is a human being fully alive. It also parallels what we're seeing about postmodernist movement from despair to aesthetics. If compassion is essential to approaching the real, what stands in the way? The ancient understanding is that our largest human failing is to think that we are God or gods. The Abrahamic traditions understand that we reflect God, that we're made in the image of God, that on a journey toward God, we may even be on the road to becoming divine, but we are not God in fullness. Our self-focus stands in the way of the real, and in some sense always will, that being the way of things. The cure or response is to turn outward in compassion toward those who are suffering. Righting human relationships is one avenue. The work of justice between human beings and in society, and relationships with all that is and all that are incrementally healed as a result. My relationship with the real is healed as I ensure that my hungry neighbor is fed today and as I work to prevent his future hunger. Love God and love your neighbor as you love yourself. The way of compassion is also the way in which power is employed to change what is broken, unjust, suffering, or life-denying. Positive regard for those who differ is part of this work, and that reality is reflected in the values research. When societies move out of survival mode, where care and concern is usually reserved for one's closest relatives, when they move out of that into an economy where knowledge is shared, that wide availability of knowledge itself makes it more possible to know and care for those who were formerly strangers, and it may lessen personal anxiety about scarcity. But in addition to mere knowledge as a resource empowering transformation, the ability of empathy and compassion to change the world should compel our concern. Compassion is a vastly different kind of power, which grows in being shared and changes human hearts and societies in ways that the power of arms or domination cannot. This is the power made perfect in weakness, of which Paul of Tarsus speaks. This is Gandhi's satyagraha, or soul force, which informed Martin Luther King's practice of nonviolence. This is the witness of Jonathan Myrick Daniels, who in the midst of the civil rights struggle in the early 1960s, stepped in front of a 14-year-old African-American girl threatened by a racist's gun and died for his trouble. This is the response to Matthew Shepard's death and Tyler Clementi's, which are transforming attitudes in this country toward gay and lesbian people. Whenever the life-denying impulses around us are met with an affirmation that life will only be more abundant in the absence of violence, transformation begins again. The creative riposte to nihilism sometimes takes remarkable form. Connie Duckworth started Arzu to import handmade rugs from Afghanistan. And she wrote contracts with women weavers that bring up to a 50% bonus if the weavers promise to send all their children, daughters and sons, to school full-time, and if the household agrees to let the women attend literacy classes. In spite of the attempts of traditional religion to shut girls away from education, change is happening. Whatever the complexities around Greg Mortenson's story, the schools he has founded are also changing reality. The rising spring of expectation in North Africa and the Middle East will never be put back in Purdah. And the young woman who's been arrested for having the temerity to drive in Saudi Arabia will not be forgotten. The very fact that the developed nations of the world collaborated in 2000 and committed to reducing the worst of the world's poverty by half by the year 2015 has changed global reality. We're not likely to meet all the benchmarks of the Millennium Development Goals in the next 4 years, but the possibility of a world that looks more like that ancient dream of plenty, justice, and peace will not likely be pushed back into an afterlife. People here tonight and around the world will continue to hold that dream in their hearts. The power to move toward a beautiful, good, and true future for all humanity rests with us and with any who share the quest for the real. We have a part in our neighbor's well-being. The death of any diminishes each of us, and we shall only know life more abundant when all begin to taste the feast. In the Christian tradition, this amounts to saying that the real lies in the direction of the way, the truth, and the life. The quest for the real actually lies toward the suffering of this world. On that road, we will discover the true, the beautiful, and the good. Now, I hope we can have some conversation. I believe there are 2 microphones here, and if you want to go to the microphones, we'll take you in order, more or less.
Thank you for a very inspirational talk. Let me ask, my observation is that over the past, let's say 20 years, the religious traditions that have gained most market share, that have grown most rapidly, have probably not been ones so much that were focused on compassion, and perhaps were more focused on a kind of the law and a rule-driven way of doing things. And what is your, would you agree with that, and then what would your reaction to that be?
I think you're right. I think they've certainly garnered the most public attention. My sense is that when human beings feel anxious, they look for security. And that's what I was trying to point to in naming the values research. When we're worried about survival and scarcity, we focus inward. And rule-based religion provides some surety about anxiety. It takes either a very conscious internal transformation of one's own anxiety to begin to turn outward, or it takes some external security in the environment to begin to turn outward. It's very difficult to do without the internal resources or the external resources. And it is something that community can help to provide, both the confidence that one can participate compassionately in the world around oneself by looking outward, or in helping to provide the material means of security.
At the end of your address, you spoke of the road to the real as towards suffering. In Buddhism, as I understand it, it's directed away from suffering, that is, to avoid suffering. Do you see that contrast, and what do you make of it?
I meant to be provocative. We move towards suffering in a compassionate response in seeking to end suffering. And I think Buddhist teaches something of the same. It teaches about recognizing where suffering, where one's internal anxieties come from. And it's only by confronting those that you can begin to let go of them.
So you would see the Buddhist as maybe a first stage, and then engaging in suffering, and then overcoming it?
Yes, I think by recognizing where suffering comes from in one's own life, I think, and I'm not a Buddhist, so I'm less than eminently qualified to respond to this. One can only let go of one's own internal suffering by confronting it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Please.
I take you to be a player on the global stage in some sense or another. That is to say, being the leader of a province of the Anglican Communion. And my sense is that the province that you represent is somewhat marginalized, not only with its own culture, but also perhaps globally as well. Could you share some observations about how you and we are doing to change the opinion of the rest of the world in some fairly significant ways, if at all?
You're speaking about the challenges within the Anglican Communion around human sexuality in particular?
I would say perhaps more generally than that, although quite often those tensions are focused in that area. I guess I'm wondering how well our influence is doing on the global stage as you perceive it to be.
Within the Anglican Communion, my sense is that the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church of Canada, with whom we are closely allied in terms of our stances and our presence in the Anglican Communion, continue to invite others who disagree with us about more inclusive attitudes toward the whole of God's people, without attempting to be offensive or aggressive, even though it's perceived that way in some quarters. The reality is that there is a diversity of opinion everywhere in the Anglican Communion, even though some voices in other cultures are far more dominant than others. The Episcopal Church has missional partnerships with every part of the Anglican Communion, even in places where the Archbishop says there aren't any, because human beings are diverse. There are communities, there are bishops and congregations in Rwanda and Uganda and Nigeria who are in partnership with churches in the United States because they believe it's important to learn about what it's like to be a Christian in another culture, to share in each other's suffering, and to share in each other's blessing, and to discover what the gifts are of living and working and worshiping in a different culture. And if we're on that road, and that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to point toward in the liberal, freeing sense of education and journey, in the long run I believe it will only lead to healing. It is the restriction and the cutting off of relationships that continue to cause more pain and suffering for everybody.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I love the image of a garage cleaning or attic cleaning. And I see that it seems to me we may be due for such a thing when I see the mainstream or mainline churches declining at the same time as a mother of 2 college students. I see this passionate hunger for spirituality and belief, and that there's both existing at the same time. And I'm wondering what you see in the future, for the growth, for the change, for that. How do we connect with that hunger? How do we also give up those old comfortable tools, which are so lovely for us cradle Episcopalians, and so comfortable?
Right. Absolutely. This room is a good example. Everybody out there is seated facing this way, expecting somebody up here to give you the truth. Our churches have tended to function that way. If we took all the chairs out of this room or unfixed them from the floor, we would have a different possibility for relationship. That's an example of where I think the church is beginning to shift its way of being. And not just staying in this room, but taking the conversation out there on the quad, going and sitting around the fountain or on the grass and seeing what questions people out there want to ask. When we begin to do more of that, we'll, I think, have begun to enter into the spirit of the garage sale.
I echo the thank you and great gratitude. I come from a parish that's closest to Hopkins Marine Station, by the way. So, but my question has to do with a comment that you made in your lecture, and that had to do with the Abrahamic face and how we began the journey together, and I think you said we can go pretty far together. Is that then, are we breaking off, or are we beginning to take steps further together and further together as we get to know each other? Could there be something like Indaba with the Jewish faith and the Muslim faith? Could that happen so that that journey towards those who are suffering and struggling we could be together on that path for a longer length of time? Do you have any views of the future?
Oh, I wholeheartedly believe so. Indaba is a Zulu word that means conversation for the purpose of reaching some decisive action. Let me give you an example. In Omaha, there is something called the Tri-Faith Initiative. The Episcopal Diocese wanted to start a congregation in a rapidly growing part of town, and they discovered a Jewish congregation there that was looking to build a new building, and a Muslim congregation that was trying to do the same, and they started talking to each other. Several years ago, they made a conscious covenant, really, with each other to say, we're going to share conversation and learning and meal together for a while and see where this takes us. They've bought land together. They're going to build a shared facility. They are going to build it with dedicated worship space for each tradition, but some shared facilities as well, and an interfaith study center. Every person I've talked to in that community from whichever tradition has said how much his or her own faith has been deepened in that process, deepened in the process of coming to know the other as a fellow traveler, as a fellow journeyer. I don't know where the end of the common path is. I don't know that there is an end. I think there is enormous possibility in entering the journey together and probably discovering that we share so much in common that the differences give our individual lives beauty and meaning, but don't divide us.
So, following up on what you just said about a common path and finding things together, would you comment on, without being divisive, what you feel that as a Christian, Christianity brings in? I don't mean so much uniquely, but in particular, what it has to contribute that would be different than other faith traditions or no faith tradition?
I'm going to speak out of the particulars of my understanding of my faith, a faith that I share with many others. I believe I'm called to love my neighbor in a way that is sacrificial, that isn't merely sacrificial in the sense of giving up, but in making the relationship holy, which is what that word means. By not focusing so much on my own needs, but equally on the needs of others. Other religious traditions will frame their work in another way. I can only frame it out of the story that I know most deeply and intimately. I come to the story through Jesus and the meaning of Jesus as incarnate, living, ministering, suffering, dying, and rising again. That's the particularity of the story in which I live. I'll go this way and then I'll come back.
I forget if it's sacred or holy that means separate from, set apart for God. And also, I don't think that people who want to be spiritual these days want to be separated. Do you see any lines of expanding or changing religion so that we can once again include people who want to be spiritual?
Wow, thank you. I think we can include, I think we're meant to include people who want to be spiritual. Too many churches are full of people who don't. They just want the answers. I think to be spiritual means to be set apart in the sense of consciously claiming a journey. It means, in some sense, to leave the path, to leave the stable place and I mean the fixed place of thinking that you have the answers and that there's no reason to keep growing and moving. Sacred in some traditions means set apart as special, and it often comes to mean, you know, what I've seen on T-shirts, Jesus loves you, but I'm his favorite. Well, I think that it applies to everybody. We bring an attitude of scarcity to what's meant to be abundant. Sacred, to me, means set apart from emptiness, in the sense of, emptiness can also be a path to the holy, but emptiness as meaninglessness or lack of relationship, or what is, I think, most classically understood as hell.
Thank you.
I have jotted down 3 questions, but I'll only ask you 2 of them. And they all come from the standpoint of one who's still trying to struggle along with the traditional religious expressions that we have inherited from our forefathers. The notion of the quest, I wonder how you would see that either nurtured by or inhibited by the current religious institutions. And similarly, as the focus shifts, and I really believe this is the way it will happen and needs to happen, toward a more mission-based religious philosophy, how will the traditional institutions of our age value that shift from a worship and fellowship-based organization to a mission-based organization?
If I look at the history of Christianity, Jesus said go, right? He didn't say stay, except abide in me. Stay in relationship with God. He said, go and make disciples. Go teach, feed, heal. Go feed my sheep. He didn't intend for people to sit down and get comfortable. Churches as worshiping communities are essential, but they're feeding stations. They're the corral where you sleep for the night and get fed, and then go out again. And then go and do what you're supposed to do, whether it's to eat grass or to make more sheep. The church gets lost when it thinks its reason for being is the people already inside of it. You know, Archbishop William Temple in the 40s said the church is the only human institution whose primary focus is the people who are not its members. And when we forget that and turn inward, we start to die, and we should.
And we are.
Yeah. When we're remembering what it is we are sent to do in mission, which is what that word means, we begin to find life again. Because the life is not solely within us. The first question was about quest and how the institution gets in the way.
Well, I said actually nurtures or inhibits. I think you're on the inhibit side, and I think I am too.
The institution is meant to nurture the journey, but as a feeding station, not as a tie-down. The airplane's meant to fly, not to stay parked.
Thank you.
Hi, my question actually follows on quite closely from that one. I was intrigued by your sort of past, looking to the past and looking to the future at the same time and connecting things across the past and the future. And I wanted to invite you to comment more on the idea of authority and religious authority, because you've characterized how we should think about religion and spirituality in the future in terms of a quest. And a quest doesn't really seem to need authority in the way that the last questioner asked. But of course, traditionally, religious institutions have assisted people in their spiritual quest through the use of authority and maybe sometimes misuse of authority. So could you say, because you brought up power and because you sort of distinguished between power of force and power of compassion, but you remain very focused on quest as the model for spiritual growth, can you just explain what role remains for authority in that picture?
Where does authority come from? I think it's a gift. It's a gift of recognition, of authenticity, integrity, congruence. We give authority to those we see leading effectively on the quest. Sometimes, institutions tend to place authority in particular individuals or groups, but that authority only has legitimacy if it can be recognized. There was a joke in Eastern Europe in the early 80s that said, most nations only need 10% of the population to, place authority on the leaders. Well, Poland's made great progress. They're down to 2%. That's what we've seen happen in North Africa. Authority has been removed from those who were purported to have it. That's what's happening in many institutions across the world. We are delegitimizing places and institutions to which we had imputed authority. And we're looking, I believe, for more authentic authority. I think communities find it together on the journey.
That doesn't sound like authority to me. That sounds like collective searching and reflection. Mm-hmm. And you brought up Augustine, and I think, I haven't looked in a while, but I think he thought there was a role for authority within one's faith development.
Authority in the Christian tradition comes by, through the institution. It comes in people like Francis of Assisi, when people just can't resist it. They see it. They see it at work. We've often named those people as saints, and sometimes they're obnoxious. Sometimes they give evidence of particular gifts in part of their lives, but some of the rest of their life looks pretty yucky. Well, welcome to the human race. Authority isn't just by virtue of office. It's got to have some congruence with a lived life. And what I'm arguing for is that there's a whole lot more authority out there that we don't go looking for to bless in the people around us.
It seems that Charles Darwin and modern science have made people see a conflict between religion and science. Well, you're a scientist yourself. So how would you address the issue of Charles Darwin and all the other recent scientific discoveries that we've made and religious faith?
It's only a problem if you assume that there's only one way to tell the story that's true. The Bible has two creation stories in Genesis. I haven't heard anybody recently try to throw one of them out. They say different things about creation. We claim that they're both true. The first one says that God creates and each day it's good. God speaks creation into existence. The second story is about Adam and Eve and what goes wrong. They're both true, even though we have focused more often on the second one. We have another creation story that talks about the Big Bang and evolution. That's a true story. It is our best scientific understanding of how things have come to be the way they are. It doesn't say a whole lot about what it means to be a human being. We look for answers to that question in this society often to the creation stories in Genesis. They're all true. They answer somewhat different questions.
Thank you so much for everything here. When you speak of suffering, I've been struggling a lot with the idea that many religious figures in my life have always claimed that it's part of God's plan or it's all meant to be. And yet suffering is not distributed equally. And there are horrific cases we could see just on YouTube or in the news when it doesn't seem to me that that's a productive way of discussion, let alone have any compassion to say that that's part of God's plan. Why is it that you think perhaps so many Christians have gotten in that spiritual and intellectual dead end? And how might traditions like Buddhism, which as far as I know, don't seek to justify suffering, just seek to escape from it, how could we help to learn from that as well?
Human beings, I think, want to understand, and sometimes the farthest they can go is to find an excuse or find somebody to blame. I think that's a part of all of us. When something doesn't make sense, we want to reject it. We want to, we often get angry at it. We want to get angry at somebody for causing it. When it is part of the contingent nature of creation, it's part of the, the order and playfulness of creation. There's no creativity if things are fully defined. You can't be made in the image of God if you're an automaton. And that includes pain, it includes suffering, it includes sickness. But the creative response to that is to seek to heal it wherever we can. I don't have a better answer than that, except to say that I believe that, God is with us in the midst of it.
So I come to the microphone as a cradle Episcopalian. I have to confess that to start with. And I have a sort of a nitty-gritty...
You're forgiven.
I'm forgiven, okay. And I have sort of a church nitty-gritty kind of question to ask you as a leader. Aside from being a cradle Episcopalian, I'm also a mother of a 6th grader. And so I find the talk of quest very interesting. And I work a lot with college students who are very much in that journey, and that spiritual searching. But as the mother of a young person, I definitely am looking to ground her in tradition, so she has that to move as a base to move from as she starts her own quest and her own journey. And we haven't had a lot of conversation in your lecture about tradition specifically. The room is of the grayer set. So I just want to ask, based on the thoughts that you expressed during your lecture, what do you see as the vision for the Episcopal Church in terms of that tradition? What can it give to my daughter as I think about her launching on her own quest? What can I count on it to provide parents as we think about the kind of foundation that tradition can provide our children?
I think that's a wonderful question. I look back on my own experience at that age in the Episcopal Church. I came into the Episcopal Church when I was not quite 9. I was invited into a confirmation process within a couple of years of that, and it included mostly memorizing the catechism. I don't remember a whole lot more about my Christian education. My sense is that many congregations are doing a much better job of inviting younger people into a process of formation that encourages them to ask questions, to learn about the base of the tradition, and to invite them into that journey. We were talking earlier today about journey to adulthood. which is a formation program for teenagers. Right 13 is used in some congregations, that invites younger people to be accompanied by elders, not necessarily ones they're directly related to, in that same kind of formative process that, you know, I kind of jokingly alluded to as taking a group of peers away, providing them some wise elders to tell them the stories, invite them into experiences that are going to stretch them. You know, that's what summer camp's about. That's what retreats are about. It's a way of telling the stories in safe places where they can begin to explore. You know, you don't take toddler out to climb Mount Everest. You take toddler on a walk in the park. And people at every stage of life ought to have appropriate opportunities to go exploring. And to know that there's some safety in the midst of that. I think we're done. Good.
We certainly want to first thank all of you, and on behalf of my colleagues in the Office for Religious Life, I'm Joanne Sanders, Associate Dean for Religious Life, and also on behalf of Emeritus Professor Bob Gregg, who you heard from earlier this evening, we want to genuinely thank you all for coming tonight. And to you, Bishop Katharine, we also owe a great thanks for your presence with us throughout the day today and this evening, and thinking about you also in this journey, this quest, that the kind of leader, pastor, healer, teacher, catalyst, and a marvelous facilitator of a garage sale that we are indebted to you for your astuteness and your wisdom, and also your remarkable humility among us. So many blessings to you in, I know, the challenges that you face, as well as we all hope the joys on some days that those challenges bring. So if we could, let's give our thanks to Bishop Katharine. We are going to have the opportunity for you to purchase some books and have them signed out just outside these doors. Bishop Katharine will be back there momentarily. And we also want to remind you that tomorrow evening in Memorial Church, the Episcopal Lutheran Campus Ministry at Stanford is hosting the, I think, 29th annual, Greg, is that right? Ascension Day service at 7:30 p.m. in Memorial Church, to which you all are invited as well. So thank you very much and have a wonderful evening.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.